When Hitler tried to negotiate peace. The secret that could have changed everything.
We must act now.
It was
The northern
spring
flank is
of
exposed. Agreed.
1941.
But we need air support. Support is
The war
confirmed.
was
Deploy at
barely 2
dawn.
years
Understood, sir.
old, and Adolf Hitler, the man who had already swallowed Poland, France, and most of Western Europe, did something that history books almost never mention. He reached out for peace. Not publicly. Not through diplomats in grand halls. But through back channels, secret couriers, and whispered conversations in smoke-filled rooms. And the terms he offered were so surprisingly reasonable that the men who received them didn't know whether to be stunned or terrified. Because here's what nobody asks: why would the most aggressive conqueror in modern history suddenly want to stop? The answer, when you find it, will completely change how you see World War II, and what you thought you knew about how close it came to ending very, very differently. But to understand the offer, you first have to understand the one man Hitler was most afraid of. And that man wasn't Churchill. It wasn't Roosevelt. It wasn't Stalin. It was someone far closer to home. Someone Hitler trusted with his life. And that man was about to do something so shocking, so unthinkable, that Hitler would stand in his study, read the intelligence report, and go completely, utterly silent. His name was Rudolf Hess, second in command of the entire Nazi regime. The man who had sat beside Hitler in Landsberg prison and transcribed Mein Kampf word by word. The man Hitler once called my closest friend. On the night of May 10, 1941, Hess walked into a hangar in Augsburg, climbed into a Messerschmitt Bf 110, and disappeared into the dark sky, alone. No escort. No orders. No permission. He was flying to Britain. When Hitler was told the next morning, eyewitnesses said the color drained from his face. He stared at the report. Said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Tell no one." But why would the Deputy Führer risk his life, his career, and his country's secrets to fly directly into enemy territory? The answer is that Hess wasn't acting out of madness. He was acting on intelligence, and on a negotiation that had already begun months earlier, through channels so secret that even today, some of those files remain classified. There was a peace plan. A real one. And it had Hitler's fingerprints all over it. But the moment Hess landed on Scottish soil and was taken prisoner, something went horribly wrong. Because the man he flew to Britain to meet had already changed sides. His name was the Duke of Hamilton. One of Britain's most respected noblemen. A decorated RAF officer. A man who had personally shaken Hitler's hand at the 1936 Berlin Olympics and exchanged private letters with senior Nazi officials for years afterward. And according to Hess, who told British interrogators this himself, the Duke was supposed to be the back channel. The bridge. The man who would bring a peace proposal directly to King George VI, bypassing Churchill entirely. The plan, as Hess described it, was breathtaking in its ambition. Hitler would halt operations in the West. Britain would keep its empire. Germany would keep continental Europe. And together, the two great Anglo-Saxon powers, as the Nazis framed it, would turn their combined strength eastward against the Soviet Union. It was, on paper, a deal that could have ended the war in the West in 1941. But Churchill, when he was informed of Hess's arrival, didn't rush to meet him. Didn't immediately interrogate him. According to the memoirs of those present, he went to the cinema. Why would the British Prime Minister, a man fighting for national survival, treat the arrival of Hitler's deputy with such casual indifference? Unless Churchill already knew exactly why Hess had come, and had spent months preparing a very different response than anything Hess was expecting. Here is a fact that intelligence historians have pieced together over decades, and that most people have never heard. British intelligence had been reading German communications for months. Thanks to the Enigma codebreakers at Bletchley Park, Churchill knew about the peace overtures almost as soon as they were made. Which means the letters Hess had exchanged with the Duke of Hamilton, the letters that convinced him Britain had sympathetic ears at the highest levels, may have been part of a deception operation all along. Hess hadn't found a secret back channel to British peace negotiators. He had walked, willingly and enthusiastically, into a trap. But here's where history takes a turn that nobody anticipated. Because buried within the Hess mission, beneath the failed diplomacy and the British deception, was a peace proposal that Churchill found genuinely alarming. Not because he was tempted by it, but because of what it revealed about Hitler's true strategic intentions. Hitler didn't want peace with Britain because he'd gone soft. He wanted peace with Britain because he was about to do something so massive, so unprecedented, that he couldn't afford a war on two fronts. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was 6 weeks away. And if Britain had said yes, if Churchill had wavered for even a moment, everything that followed might have been unimaginably different. But Churchill didn't waver. Instead, he made a decision so cold, so ruthlessly calculated, that even his closest advisers were shaken by it. Churchill knew that Rudolf Hess, sitting in a British prison, believing he had come to negotiate peace, was one of the most valuable intelligence assets Britain had ever stumbled upon. And he made an immediate decision. Hess would tell the world nothing useful. He was to be kept isolated. His messages to Hitler blocked. His attempts to communicate with German officials intercepted and suppressed. And the full details of what he had offered, the specific terms, the guarantees, the names of those involved, were to be sealed away. Some of those files would remain classified for over 60 years. Why? Churchill's reasoning, as reconstructed by historians, was chilling in its logic. If the full terms of Hitler's peace offer became public, it could fracture the Allied coalition before it had even fully formed. It could embolden British appeasers, and there were still powerful ones in Parliament. It could signal to Hitler exactly how much Britain knew about Barbarossa. And perhaps most dangerously, it could reach Washington, where Roosevelt was still fighting a fiercely isolationist Congress, and hand his enemies exactly the argument they needed. See? Hitler offered peace. Britain refused. Why should our boys die for that? So Churchill buried it. And Hess, the man who had flown alone across the North Sea to end a war, spent the rest of his life in prison. He died in Spandau in 1987, aged 93, the last prisoner in a jail built for hundreds. He went to his grave insisting the mission could have worked. But what he never knew, what nobody told him, was the other peace negotiation. The one that happened not through a daring solo flight, but through something far more mundane. A series of letters. Delivered through a neutral country. Signed not by a Nazi official, but by someone on the Allied side. In late 1939 and early 1940, before the fall of France, before Dunkirk, before the Blitz, there was a period historians call their phony war. British and German forces faced each other across borders, but major fighting had not yet erupted in the West. During this window, a remarkable series of secret communications passed through Stockholm. Swedish diplomats, acting as intermediaries, carried proposals from Berlin to London and back again. The German terms, reconstructed from documents released decades later, were consistent. Germany would withdraw from Western Poland, guarantee Belgium and the Netherlands, halt naval operations in the Atlantic, and recognize British
Gentlemen, this is our
imperial
opportunity.
sovereignty
We
in
must
exchange
act,
for a
but the
free
risks
hand
are
in
significant.
Eastern Europe.
We can't ignore them. We move
Britain's
forward.
formal response was always no. But the informal responses, the delays, the requests for clarification, the carefully worded non-rejections, told a different story. Because there was a faction within the British government, led by one of its most senior figures, that believed negotiation wasn't just possible, it was necessary. And that man came within hours of convincing the War Cabinet to open formal talks. His name was Lord Halifax. And had he succeeded, Churchill's premiership might have lasted less than 2 weeks. The cabinet meeting that decided the fate of the war lasted 3 days. We have the minutes. We know what was said. And the margin by which Britain chose to fight instead of talk was far, far narrower than any history textbook has ever admitted. But even that wasn't the last attempt. Because in 1943, with the war turning against Germany at Stalingrad, Hitler authorized something even more extraordinary. And this time, he used a channel that had been hiding in plain sight for years. His name was Alan Dulles. He was an American lawyer working out of Bern, Switzerland, officially attached to the US Embassy. In reality, he was the OSS station chief, America's chief intelligence operative in Europe. And in 1943, a senior German official sat down across from him in a quiet Swiss restaurant and made an offer. The German was Adam von Trott zu Solz, a Rhodes Scholar, an anti-Nazi resistance figure, and a man so trusted by the German Foreign Ministry that he travelled freely across occupied Europe. He had come with a message from a group of senior German officers and officials who were planning to remove Hitler from power. But they needed something in return. They needed a guarantee that if they succeeded, if they killed Hitler and sued for peace, the Allies would negotiate with a post-Hitler Germany rather than demand unconditional surrender. Dulles was electrified. He fired off cables to Washington and London. He argued, passionately, that this was real, that the resistance was genuine, that the opportunity was historic. Roosevelt and Churchill said no. Unconditional surrender. No exceptions. The German resistance, denied the guarantee they needed to bring wavering officers on board, pressed ahead anyway. On July 20, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Storfenbing placed a briefcase bomb under a table at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters. The bomb went off. Hitler walked out of the rubble, shaken but alive. And the last, best chance to end the war from within Germany died with the conspirators on the gallows that followed. But even after July 20th, even after the failed assassination, even with Allied armies advancing from the west and Soviet forces closing from the east, Hitler made one more attempt. One final, desperate, strange effort to split the Allies and negotiate his way out of the catastrophe he had created. By late 1944, Germany was losing on every front. Paris had fallen. Rome had fallen. The Soviet army had crossed into Poland. Hitler was living underground in the Wolf's Lair, then the Reich Chancellery bunker, conducting a war that his generals privately knew was already lost. And yet, in September 1944, through channels in Madrid and Stockholm, a proposal was quietly circulated. Germany would withdraw to its 1937 borders. It would surrender occupied territories in the West. It would accept Allied oversight of its military. In exchange, peace. A negotiated end. No occupation. No war crimes tribunals. No unconditional surrender. The target audience wasn't Britain or America. It was the Soviet Union. Hitler, or those acting on his behalf, calculated that Stalin might be tempted. That the Soviet dictator, having borne the catastrophic weight of 4 years of war, might prefer a negotiated settlement over the cost of fighting all the way to Berlin. Stalin received the overture. He shared it, immediately, with Churchill and Roosevelt. And here is where the story becomes almost unbearably ironic. Because Stalin, the man Hitler had betrayed in 1941 with the most savage surprise attack in military history, was the one who refused most absolutely. The one who insisted, with the Allies, on unconditional surrender. The one who arguably did the most to ensure Hitler could never negotiate his way out. Whether this was justice, revenge, or cold strategic calculation, historians still debate it. But as the walls closed in around Berlin in the spring of 1945, and as Hitler prepared for the end, he still believed, with whatever remained of his rational mind, that the alliance would fracture. That the Americans and Soviets would turn on each other before Germany fell. He was wrong. But he wasn't entirely delusional about why he thought it. Because there was one final secret, one last negotiation happening without his knowledge in the closing days of the war.
Gentlemen, this proposal is our best option, but the risks are too high. We must consider the alternatives.